My name's Mark Powell, label manager of Esoteric Antenna for Cherry Red Records. You're watching Cherry Red TV, and in April this year, Esoteric Antenna released the album State by Todd Rundgren. And I'm pleased to say that with us today on Cherry Red TV is Todd Rundgren. Todd, thanks very much for taking some time out.
Thanks for having me.
It's all right. It's been a busy touring schedule for you since State's come out. You've done a big American tour, and now you're over in Europe.
Yeah, it's pretty much the longest chunk of touring I've done in years at least. Right about now, right about 5 or 6 weeks in, that's when we'd be ending. But we're really just kind of getting started at this point. We go back to the States and we do a couple more weeks there, and then we go to Australia, come back, do a few more weeks in the States, go to Japan, then come back and do a few more weeks in the US, and then in the fall I may get a month or so off, and then I go out with Ringo in November.
So it's a pretty full-on year for you this year.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, it started in February with Ringo when we went to Australia and Japan. So when am I going to see my home again? Well, only in pictures at this point.
Well, the State tour has been very interesting because of the fact that, unlike last time you were over here in the UK, you've got, including yourself, 3 musicians on stage.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess the stage shows have got a kind of relationship to what you did with No World Order back in '94, where a lot of the stuff is being operated,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the music is operated from a computer.
Yeah, that is true, although even though it's hard to tell because every once in a while the computer goes off and then, I have to dance around and cover for it. But things are actually a little simpler to do now than they were back in the No World Order days, because I had to build a whole software and hardware system from scratch. And not only did that take months, but then on the road, setting it up every night was always something of a nightmare. So we've got it pretty much down to a system now, and it's a lot easier to mount. It kind of stems from an idea of being, like super stripped down. Like I could potentially do a show just with me and a laptop. But I wanted to mount a performance that was a little bit more, it had a little bit more blood in it because I've got more players on stage. I've got 2 whole other players. It's a trio, wow. That's so I could afford a lighting designer and lights because that seemed more apropos to the show. And also, it's not strictly a DJ thing. Partly because since I had the 2 other guys, we have yet to work out a system of improvisation where I can just call a song on the fly or call a loop on the fly or something like that. We're probably getting to that point. It was kind of breaking in the show as it was, and ideally at some point it'll be a lot more improvisational. But for now, I've got to spend a lot of time on the mic, so I can't be mucking about too much with the machinery. I'm pretty much queuing everything up and setting it off when it's time. A little bit of noodling around, but otherwise I got to stay on the mic too much.
What was the actual inspiration for State? Because it's some would say it's a departure from what you've done previously, but then again, every album you've done is probably a departure from the previous one to some extent.
Yeah, that would be a truism, and fortunately, most of the fans who are still listening now are cognizant of that fact, and so there's a little less indignance than I used to experience back in the day when people still remembered Something Anything and all the hits from that, even though I might be 2, 3, 4 albums removed from it. At this point, anyone who's stuck with me this long kind of is there for the ride, is there for the constant evolution or devolution or whatever of the music, the fact that it isn't the same every time, that it's not presented the same way every time. And State in particular was kind of a reaction to the fact that a lot of younger artists have been um, citing my early work as being inspirational to them. Uh, Probably not realizing the kind of grief that I went through at the time that, for instance, A Wizard of True Star was released, and the fact that that was a radical change from Something Anything. So I think anyone who doesn't understand that the music is going to be different every time probably is in the bare minority at this point. I mean, every once in a while a guy shows up at the show with his date thinking that it's going to be an evening of tender ballads, and they both go home disappointed, you know. I feel sorry for them and certainly happy to refund the ticket price, but geez, come on, it's 2013 now,
Yeah.
it's not 1973 anymore.
So when you recorded State, in fact, it's a process you've been using for quite a while now. You've been doing it pretty much at home
Hmm.
as a one-man band, essentially, using sort of Apple technology and so on like that. Is that something you decided to do deliberately? Have you sort of eschewed the use of studios, do you think, from here on out, and you just want to use the home?
Well, since my very first records, there has been a greater or lesser participation of other musicians, and in some cases none at all. Something Anything, first three sides, no other players on that. Herman and Mikalo, no other players on that album. They kind of vary. No World Order, that's all me. Even Arena, which sounds like a band, is all me. So it's been something that I've been comfortable with and been doing pretty much since I started making records. And I suppose it was all, as so many things are, inspired by the Beatles and the way that they kind of fearlessly picked up any instrument that they felt they could make a sound with and somehow incorporate it into their music. I remember the back of the first Beatles album that I saw that had a picture of the four of them in a kind of very posy thing, Ringo's hand on George's shoulder or something like that. But underneath it, it listed all the instruments that they played on the record, even going so far as to list maracas. Went to school to learn how to play maracas or something like that. But there was a whole list of Arabian drum, organ, everything that they touched during the course of the record was cited there. And of course, as the Beatles progressed, they incorporated all manner of sort of instrumentations that we kind of take for granted now, but in those days was very unusual in a pop context. Eleanor Rigby, the whole string quartet that went with that. George Harrison's adoption of the sitar. And as they went on, they began to use the studio as well as you could say as a musical instrument in a sense. They started thinking up interesting and unusual ways to incorporate the equipment. I've heard stories, Ringo's told me stories about some of the bizarre things they did in order to get like a tape loop of a certain length. They had to take a 2-track tape and splice together a big 20-foot loop, and 3 or 4 of them would have to be holding the tape as it ran through the machine, because it would otherwise fall on the floor and get all tangled up. So just, all of the challenges that they went through in order to push the envelope in that regard, I always took that to heart as well. Began to see the studio as an instrument in itself. So the whole idea of making records by yourself, that came to me very, very early on. I decided that I needed to have a studio of my own very early on and built one to my own bizarre specifications, and that was where A Wizard of True Star was recorded. And I don't know that the record would have sounded the same if it had been done another way, if it had been done in a more conventional kind of book a studio, come in and do some recording, and then someone else comes in after that. We pretty much occupied the space for the entire time the record was being made, and that was sort of a new thing.
So I guess that sort of approach enabled you to be, when the muse struck you, you could actually just turn on the equipment and just go in there and start recording without having to work on that.
And I do.
Yeah.
As well, you know, that's pretty much what you do. You turn it on, you just start messing around. But it's more practical than that. At this point, I'm mixing a soundtrack for a live performance while I'm on the road. And there was a time not very long ago when that was impractical, because the equipment was expensive and bulky and, you know, hard to transport. And advances in computer technology and other, you know, conceptual, I would say, advances. You know, people start thinking in a different way, and then suddenly they come up with better ways to do things, I suppose. And all of this has collapsed down into the laptop in maybe just the last 10 years. And along with that has created an entire generation of musicians who perhaps never have been in a studio, or they think of the studio as their laptop. So as long as they've got that, they're able to create, and they don't think that there's any reason why they have to wait to get into that, you know, specific kind of pristine environment that was created principally for sonic isolation. You know, the whole idea of a studio, more than anything else, was to keep the sounds you didn't want out and keep the sounds that you did want from getting out. So the whole idea of going under the headphones and doing a whole project from under the headphones, that's a new thing as well. And I've sort of responded, I suppose, you know, to this whole evolution by diving in myself. More recently, a lot of my work, even if I'm playing everything myself, is an attempt to sound like a group of musicians, to sound like more conventional instrumentation. And lately, a lot of that has just gone out the window. The whole idea sometimes of making records is just to be sonically disorienting or arresting in some way. You create an environment that is that can't possibly exist in the physical world, and that somehow causes the brain to either completely reject it or become very much involved in it in a way. And I always found that, you know, the psychoacoustic aspects of making music very interesting as well. And so we're in a phase where people are really aggressively exploring that, and I'm just trying to keep up with what's going on in a way.
Because even on stage, you don't use the guitar amplifiers anymore. Is that all amp modules that you use on iPads or whatever when you do that on stage these days?
Well, I use a program called Reason, which is the same program that I used to create the music with. And it isn't used in a live context as often as some other software, but I wanted to leverage the investment I had made in learning it and not have to learn a different piece of software. So I developed a methodology for doing it, but within that program is all the amp modeling stuff, all of the effects that you would need. In addition, you know, to running my guitar through it in order to get that sound, my voice runs through the system as well, so that from song to song I am automatically creating the necessary effects for each song. And so this is probably the easiest gig for a sound mixer to mix. All he gets is like pretty much the voice on one track with all its effects, you know, and all of the the rhythm instruments sans the drums, all of the musical part of it sans the drums and the guitar. He gets that all mixed as well. And on rare occasions, I will actually take, for instance, the drums into my system and do processing on those. But yeah, we're essentially running like 8 channels. Usually when I got my whole band, we've got 12 to 16 channels for the drums alone. Mm. But since we're using electronic drums, that all comes down to like a stereo bus or 6 buses or less buses, certainly, than we usually have to occupy when we're doing the drums. So it's made the sonic part of the setup fairly simple.
It must be a lot to think about, though, when you're actually on stage, not only performing but controlling all that as well, and being responsible for that.
I was kind of petrified before we did it the first time, even though I had done the whole No World Order thing. The first time I did that, it was petrifying. As a matter of fact, the first time I did that, it was a disaster. We had, by some unfortunate coincidence, decided to start the tour in Japan, the No World Order tour. And I was working up until the last minute trying to get everything all together, realizing that the equipment had to go on a boat. It would take like a week or 2 to get there. So in between, I'm just I don't have the stuff. I'm not working on it. I'm not able to debug it or practice with it or anything like that. It just shows up in Japan. And we had trouble with the grounding in the building and power, like people were getting electrical shocks from everything and sparks were flying out of it. And there were people lined up outside in the rain. It's an hour past doors. It's an hour past showtime, and I had to just invite them in and do 5 acoustic numbers because we couldn't get anything to work.
Wow.
And then kind of canceled the next couple of dates, worked on it for a week, and managed to get a couple of shows off. But fortunately for this show, there's nothing of that kind of imminent danger and disaster. But we do have little things, little problems. And certainly little problems could turn into big problems. Like, for instance, if we took the computer out of its case and it would not start, that would be a whole problem there. Even though I have it backed up in my laptop, I've never tried to perform it from the laptop. So there's still a great potential for disaster there. And indeed, the other night, the computer just spontaneously decided to shut down. Just like in the middle of a song, window came up and said, "Shutting down." I'm not a Windows guy, you understand. I'm pretty much an Apple Macintosh guy, but Apple for some reason does not make a touch screen that's 23 inches big. And so you otherwise have to, like squint at the really tiny, 14-inch screen and try and move the cursor around and land it on something tiny. And there have been, some issues here and there, control issues and stuff, but fortunately none of the shows have actually been brought fully to their knees, even when the computer shut down spontaneously. It didn't take too long for it to come back up, and I had Jesse play a little ditty for the audience, song they all seem to know for some reason. That looked like a danger there because I felt the audience was going to turn on me and demand we do an acoustic set suddenly.
Would you say that you've always enjoyed that sort of slight risky element in your live performances? Because I can think, going all the way back, to the 70s, with some of the shows you did with Utopia, when you first put Utopia together, there was always that.
Oh yeah, well that was literally physically dangerous. That show, when I would have to walk up the pyramid and flip off the top, that was literally, potentially kill yourself, kind of dangerous. But I always felt that the reason why people want to see a performance is because it's out of the ordinary. It isn't safe. Once you start it, you can't stop it. I mean, in people's everyday jobs, if they got to go to the bathroom, they leave their desk and they go to the bathroom. But if I have to go to the bathroom, I can't leave the stage. I just got to stay up there and suffer. And people, they appreciate performance, they appreciate sport, and music, all because it's one of these things that takes you into a sort of different level of intensity. It is performance. It's out of the ordinary. It's the reason why you pay for it. It's you want to see somebody do something you can't do. You want to see someone do something that few people can do or few people would do, and that's why sports exists. That's why entertainment exists, not necessarily why music exists, but it's why the performance aspect of it exists. And I kind of enjoy the fact that I'm in a certain space while that's happening. I'm in that performance space, that real-time space where everything has to just continue, go. You can't stop no matter how tired you feel. You can't stop it even if you feel like throwing up. You have to just keep going. It is in some ways like running a marathon often. And I think that I am probably in better physical condition than the average person because of it. Because for 2 hours a night, I am doing rather intense aerobics. People don't realize how much work goes into singing, but singing for an hour and a half straight is pretty physically strenuous activity. And you don't count, that doesn't even count the geeking around on stage that I do on top of it. So I always feel that I'm more healthy in some ways when I'm on the road, even though I am exposing myself also to the debaucheries of the road.
You mentioned singing, and for me, your voice, I think it probably gets better actually as the years have gone on. Is it something you put a lot of rehearsal into in terms of your voice? Do you actually practice a lot, or is it something that you just do on the night?
I started very late in life as a singer. Most people start out like when they're very young. And I liked to sing, but never thought of myself as a front person, and so I wasn't going to write a bunch of stuff for myself to sing when I started out. But as time went on, I realized that I wanted to express my own ideas in music and had to take the singing more seriously. And while at first it was mostly a studio exercise, I would just be, struggling to stay in tune, to hit the notes, that sort of thing. Still not a very comfortable or fun thing for me to do, but it was like a necessity in some sense. You have to express yourself, and so you do it. But when I would have to go out on the road and perform, I just could not get through 20 minutes. And in those days, a set was only 40 minutes, and I couldn't get through half of it without blowing my voice out. And it took years, probably, of constantly blowing my voice out for it to finally get to the point that it would have been if I had started singing seriously much earlier. And I also had to learn certain things that I suppose a teacher would have taught me, but I never thought about getting vocal lessons. I got my vocal lessons from listening to other singers like Stevie Wonder. And in particular, there was a record called Signed, Sealed, Delivered, and the way that they produced the records at Motown in those days, super compression. Everything was really heavily compressed, especially the singing. And so you could hear every breath he was taking, and I had, it just became a revelation. I realized that he was singing from his diaphragm, not from his throat. And then the sudden realization of that gave me a whole other dimension to my singing. It moved from my head down into my chest. I stopped blowing my voice out, or I realized when it was appropriate to blow my voice out, which helped in a way. It's one of those things where, if you were to go to the gym and try and build up your muscles and stuff, if you stop the minute that it becomes uncomfortable, nothing ever happens. Because the only thing that builds up your muscles is essentially damaging them. You have to damage them, and then they replace themselves and bulk themselves up in anticipation of more damage. So the same is true with the voice. It involves so much muscle in it, and particularly your diaphragm. And so when I get on the road at first, my diaphragm is not in the best shape. It takes probably a week or so of being on the road for it to get really built up. Mm-hmm. But it's the kind of thing you can't, it's the kind of thing I can't do when I'm not in front of an audience, because I don't feel the same kind of urgency. I don't feel the same kind of urgency to sing for an hour straight or sing for an hour and a half straight, which would be necessary in order to get that effect. So I guess over time I have developed a superior diaphragm, if you were. It's actually, there is a big hard lump right here that a lot of people don't have, and even a lot of singers don't have, because they haven't gone that extra mile to build up that muscle. But once it gets to a certain point, I can sing all night. Until that muscle gets tired, I can sing, because it actually takes a lot less work to get this part in shape than it does to get this part in shape. And when I learned that, that's when I, started to progress as a singer, and it just continues to this day. And it's probably because years and years and years and years of strengthening that particular muscle. When that muscle goes, I don't know what I'll do. But, it's the reason why Stevie Wonder can still hit those notes. It's the reason why Tony Bennett can still hit those notes. It's because of that muscle.
Yeah. Would you say, over your career, it's been a vast stylistic, or you've covered so many stylistic areas in your career. Mm-hmm. Would you say that starting off and having hits very, very early on in your career was a curse rather than a blessing to some extent, when you had Hello, It's Me and I Saw the Light and so on? Did you find that then that sort of shackled you, or put some extra pressure on you to sort of maintain that hit making process, or was that pressure put on you rather than?
I have never felt boxed in by the arc of my career, at any particular point. People sometimes think I do things just to be contrarian, which is not true either. What I have to remind everyone is that after I left the Nas, I was kind of down on all aspects of your career that didn't have to do with making the music in the first place. With going into the studio and making, I was way into the idea of writing songs and recording songs, but I was not into the whole traveling, playing the crappy clubs, meeting the crappy local promoters and promotion men and that sort of stuff. In those days, it was still pretty crass, but it was still back in the 60s, and I remember a gig where the Nas, we got off a plane and somewhere in Texas or something like that, and the local promotional man met us with 4 prostitutes, and we were all, I was still I was 19 years old or something, 19 or 20 years old. I had never had a prostitute in my life. So I thought, is this what it's really like, Is it really like all of those stories? It really is like that. And I decided, no, I don't want to be involved in that. I don't want to be a front man. I don't want to deal with a celebrity. So I started working on other people's records, engineering and producing for the Albert Grossman organization and did pretty well at it. I was young. I had no family to support. I had no vices outside of music. So I was essentially making more money than I even knew I had. At some point, they came to me and said, listen, you have to buy a house or something because you got so much money in the bank that IRS is just going to take it from you. So you have to start spending it. And my career as a solo artist became just kind of my hobby, I guess. After I produced a few records for the Grossman organization, I said, well, I got some songs I've been running. I'd like to get them down on record. Can I have a small budget and go make a record? Which I did, and they were kind of taken aback at the breadth of it, but also the fact that it had a potential hit single on it. Which I never, I thought it was a weird, bizarre song that would never make it on the radio, but apparently it did. And from that point on, I had to start thinking in terms of, how people were reacting to my music and how much of that I wanted to consider in terms of my creative process. After all, I was getting a lot of often musical satisfaction out of producing other artists as well. So it wasn't like I needed that. And then when I did Something Anything, it was almost a subconscious process. I started writing songs with such glibness that by the time I got to the end of it, I kind of felt a little unfulfilled, I guess. Because I hadn't invested a whole lot in the material. It was getting too easy for me. I was writing the same kinds of changes, and the lyrics were always the same thing everyone was writing, about some sort of relationship gone wrong. And I was plumbing the possibilities of like one relationship that I'd had in high school. And then every song was essentially about that. I thought, wait, there's got to be more to write about in the world. I'm over that by now. That's when A Wizard of True Star happened, and I began to realize, hey, I've got all this real estate. I can do anything I want with it. It drove the record label crazy. I had just come off an album with 3 hit singles on it, and then I put out a record that doesn't even have anything that sounds like a single on it. But to me, that was like, that's the Beatles. They put out the Revolver, and then they put out Sgt. Pepper, which had no singles on it. Which people don't remember that. They put out a single, but Sgt. Pepper had no singles at all on it. And yeah, the furor over that was just, it didn't bother me. I said this was the record I intended to make. As a matter of fact, I got more satisfaction out of this record than I did out of the one that you guys like so much. And I was still producing other people. So there was never that, at least I was never putting pressure on myself to prop up my own career or to do things that would further my so-called career over my career as a producer, which was going great. I had all the money I needed. I was making gold records for other people. So I thought I can do whatever I want when I make my own music. And that's kind of continued to this day. Fortunately, I can actually make money off of my own music at this point if I'm willing to go out and play enough.
Does it bother you then that the audience, you might do something that some members of the audience might walk out during a show because you mentioned about people who might turn up expecting ballads and then you deliver something
Well, I'm
like
sure
the
many
stage
did,
stuff?
and as a matter of fact, there was a period in my life when I didn't really do solo shows. I decided that, okay, I'll be in a band, and this band will be, a musical cooperative so that I don't have to, write everything, and therefore it isn't all like on me, even though a lot of people refused to take the focus off me. They still wanted it to be about me more than they wanted it to be about a band. But fortunately, the band came about in an era when that kind of music was becoming very popular. And eventually, Utopia was filling arenas, selling more tickets than I ever possibly could. I could still sell an Agora, you know, with 800 to 1,200 seats, you know, but Utopia, we're selling out Auditorium Theater and the Richfield Coliseum and all these other big venues, you know, with thousands and thousands of people. So a lot of the fans who are still my fans, they went through that avenue. They weren't so much devoted to everything that I did as they were drawn in by the whole sort of Utopia thing, the big shows, the big long shows. You know, in those days we played like 4-hour sets and things like that, you know, but with 3 keyboard players and a guitar player all playing extended solos on every song. You know, but as time went on, you know, Utopia, it kind of met its logical conclusion, and I started taking my own solo shows more seriously. And it started out mostly with like a one-man show, but with a lot of technology. I would take 2 video projectors out, and I would do some computer improvisations, and I had a video synthesizer, so I would do funny waving my arms around, you know, with colorful trails and stuff on the video projectors, and kind of a multimedia show in the early 80s. And that went over really well. I kind of milked that for a while. But after a while, I got kind of tired of just being up there by myself. So started evolving through a more ensemble phase that began with a cappella. I believe I took 11 singers out on the road, and that was great. And that kind of, you know, my audience liked that. You know, they liked the material in that particular thing. And then probably in a solo sense peaked around the late 80s with Nearly Human and Second Wind, because that was like a big review. It was kind of something I always wanted to do but could never afford to do. But the records had enough success, and I built up enough loyalty with the audiences that began to do pretty good business again with that. And we were able to tour. Well, I was getting big in Japan, and that was great. We were touring Japan every year, you know, and I was able to take, you know, like a 12-piece with horns and background singers and everything to Japan and all around the States. So after that, my relationship with major labels kind of came to an end. I started to think of things to do that involved computers that the labels didn't understand at all, but yet they wanted to own. And so I kind of went to Warner Brothers and said, you know, I've only got one more album that I owe you, and you don't want to pay me the advance for it, so we'll just end it here. So after Nearly Human, that was the end of my traditional record label affiliation. And from that point on, I would make the records myself and then find distributorship for it, and then go out and flog them on the road.
With having such a long career, does the prospect of making music still excite you? How do you still get that motivation to do it? And because many other performers get cynical as they get older, and I don't think you're musically cynical in any way. There's never a sense of anything that you do exploiting your audience like there is with maybe some other artists. It's very much a case that it comes across that you're still excited by what you're creating. And
yeah, and it's because I have, you know, bitten the bullet and more or less forcibly educated my audience about, you know, what it is I want to do. And it's not "Hello, It's Me" for the rest of my life. It was the first song I ever wrote, you know, and I know that there's a kind of artist and a kind of audience-artist relationship that's completely dependent on that. You know, that if you stop doing my way, the audience will just leave you and not come back. But I don't have that kind of audience. I have a different kind of audience, an audience that also remains excited about music as they get older. They don't see it as being, just a certain era and then everything else sucks after that, which is kind of the way, our parents were. They only liked the music that they grew up with, and anything that, once they were grown-ups and their kids started listening to their music, they said, "Phew, that you kids don't know what music is." But, I find that it was never the kids who didn't know what music was. It was the industry that never knew what music was. The industry always wanted it to be a product, something easy to sell, something expected, something measurable, something, to use an example, every once in a while I will do a talk for some interested parties about my other job. I've had a job as a producer, I had a job as an artist. My other job is as a speculator, as a futurist, I suppose, because I get involved in trends very early on. I try to understand technologies early on so I can figure out how they will impact me and how I might be able to leverage them in some way. And so people think that I know things before they happen, or I see things before they happen, even though all the evidence is there. And I essentially give this lecture about the history of the music business, which is much shorter than people sort of think it is. A lot of people think that making a living off of records is something that many artists have done for a long time. But for the most part, artists don't make a living off of records. They make a living off of playing live and always have. And if you have a record that sells 1 million copies, of course, first you subtract the cost of making the record, and then you subtract any advances you took, and you subtract the physical cost of manufacturing, or the physical cost of distribution, or all of the publishing and everything else, all the little pieces that come out of a record that go to other people besides the artist. If you're lucky, or if you had a great manager who negotiated well for you, you might be making 15 to 20% of the cost of the record. And an LP, I can peaked somewhere around $20 at one point. So yeah, under the best circumstance, something that sells for $20, you might get $3 or $4 out of it. So if it sold 1 million copies, you'd be doing all right. You would see a couple $1 million. But if it sold 1 million copies and then you go out on the road behind that record, you're going to be making that every month. You're going to make it every month because the ticket, it costs twice as much at least as the album does, and you're making 80% of the ticket. Exactly. So, any artist with any brains, all they're thinking about when a record is a hit, get out on the road, This is how you really reap the benefits of it, not by sitting at home thinking the record company is going to come dump money on your lawn. And it's always been that way. And in a sense, record labels are always just the tail, that the dog is wagging. They're waiting for the next big thing to exploit, things like that. But the problem came when they started trying to apply market analysis to music in order to guarantee success. So I remember those days, when I would deliver a record to the label and they say, well, do you think there's a single on there? And say, well, we're not sure, but all right, we'll send this song to Arbitron, see what they say. And essentially they would, like they were testing out a new breakfast cereal or something like that. They have what they consider a representative audience, and then they play the music for them, and they sit there with a little dial responding to the record as it's played. And all of that would be, collapsed down into one number, a number somewhere, between 50 and 100. And if the number was not like above 85 or something like that, the record label figured, well, it's not worth investing in it. We're not even going to bother to put the single out. We can't go to the stations and say that it got a big number at Arbitron. And I'm thinking, you mean the audience doesn't even get a chance to vote on this? The audience at large doesn't get, the DJs don't get a chance to vote on this at all. The people who actually play and listen to the music, they don't even get a chance, to weigh in on what they think about the music. And so, the ultimate collapse of the majors, that was just inevitable. When you don't understand your audience, you don't understand your product, you don't understand anything, I mean, when new listening devices come out and people migrate to them, it's not their fault. It's not the audience's fault that this new thing is available and it makes it more convenient for them to listen to music, so they adapt it into their lifestyle. But if you don't understand the lifestyle of your audience, you're never going to succeed. The whole idea of like suing people because they're downloading MP3s, suing your audience, suing your customers. That's the way to be successful in the business, And the whole RIAA thing was such a contradictory mess. I mean, you take a company like Sony. They're putting out records that can be turned into MP3s, so they're there with the RIAA suing anybody who attempts to do anything like that. At the same time, Sony is making MP3 players. The same, and that division is also under the RIAA, So it just became incredibly just a dog eating its own tail, or a snake eating itself. It just ate itself. The industry just freaking ate itself. And now what is there? 1, 2 major labels. And what do? They just do custodial work, essentially. There's nothing exciting about working at a big major record label anymore.
And so do you see yourself as, well, I guess you've always been outside of that to some degree as well, that kind of thing, by doing your own thing and by having such a loyal audience to that extent, you manage to have that freedom to do what you like creatively.
Yeah, it's partly that, and also partly because I realized at a certain point that there was an element of poison and constantly recommitting to these major labels, of like poisoning yourself in a way. I know this because, we had meetings with the special products divisions of all the labels. I was in charge of trying to mount an interactive TV experiment that was in a community in Orlando, Florida. I wasn't in charge of the whole thing, but I was in charge of the on-demand music services. We were going to see, this is before the internet, really. This is in 1992 or something. And essentially it was an experiment to see whether people wanted to have on-demand music services in their home, to have a menu and say, I want to hear that song, or I want to hear this album now. I don't own it, but I want to hear it. And this was sponsored by the Warner Full Service Network. I think that's what they call it, Warner Full Service Network. A division of Warner Brothers. Also, they got Warner Brothers Records in there, stuff like that. We went to all of Warner's was one of them. We went to all their special products division and say, this is an experiment now, but we want to put music on service to see whether people will respond to that, whether there's demand for that. Not a single one would go for it. Wouldn't even hear about it. The whole idea, in fact, they were petrified that it would succeed. And the reason why is they couldn't figure out how to extricate themselves from the brick and mortar part of their business. They said, well, as soon as Walmart finds out, that we're delivering music directly to people in their homes, in other words, we're going around them, well, they're just not going to stock our records at all. And so instead of biting the bullet, and saying, this is a transition we've got to make, we've got to go where the audience is going. Instead, they just fought it tooth and nail the entire way. And that's why they collapsed,
And now the irony is we have Spotify, which they're all rushing to be part of now. Which
Exactly.
is,
You know, I'm a big Rhapsody fan. You know, and since that point, I always thought the whole idea of music being a product, thing. You know, a piece of plastic, paper and plastic. That was the illusion that the whole record industry wanted to maintain in perpetuity. You know, that music was a thing. Music is a service. It's never anything until somebody starts playing it, you know, or until you hear it, you know. The whole idea that, certainly there are collectors of things, you know. You want to collect album covers, fine. But when you want to hear music, the thing doesn't matter anymore. You just want to hear it. And the resistance, you know, to the whole idea of music being a service is just delaying the inevitable anyway. And ultimately, once it does become a service, there's going to be so much money in it for everybody, you know, that you'll wonder why people were fretting about it in the first place. Look at cable television, cable and satellite television. You don't turn off your cable when you go on vacation for 2 weeks. So you're watching no cable at all, but you're still paying the cable bill, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Or you get really busy where you got no time, you know, to watch it, but you're not going to turn off your cable. You'll just pay your cable bill and you'll get caught up, you know, when you've got the time to watch. You know, you want it there when you want it. And it'd be the same thing with music, you know. I'm a Rhapsody subscriber, and there are months when I don't go on Rhapsody at all. But I'm happy to be a Rhapsody subscriber because when I do get in the mood and I want to listen to something, there's no barriers at all. I can listen to anything I want. I don't have to think about it. So I'm not going to cancel my Rhapsody for a month. You know, it doesn't matter. I'll just pay you for the whole year up front and use it when I use it. But the point is, under that model, you know, there's always money just coming in constantly. And if you look at cable television, there's new production all the time. They're always making like feature films off of cable revenues at this point. And there's no reason why the music business can't be equally as healthy. You know, if they just move to the subscription model, everyone will just keep paying in without even thinking about it. You know, $10 a month without even thinking about it.
I suppose the last question I want to ask you is what does the future hold for you, do you think, musically and creatively? Do you see yourself just carrying on?
Well, there's some times when I just, you know, when everything's kind of wide open and I don't know exactly where it's going. But I'm in a phase right now where I'm getting much more involved with other artists, and particularly artists of the newer generation. And I'm going to kind of play that out as long as it works. It's inspiring for me because they all have, you know, fresh ideas, things like that. You need, as you get older, particularly as you get as old as I am, you need to refresh your audience. You know, people my age, they don't go out as much. They probably have, in general, lost their sort of burning interest in music. They certainly are not interested in what's the newest or latest or whatever, unless there's some freak element about it, you know, like Lady Gaga or something like that. So essentially, they're not going to be consuming what I'm putting out, at least not in as great numbers, you know, and let's face it, there's that natural attrition of, you know, my older artists are shuffling off this mortal coil.
Yes.
So you have to, if you want to, you know, remain vital, you know, constantly keep your audience refreshed. You know, and any artist who's able should probably, you know, start considering that. You know, it's like, where would Tony Bennett be now unless he had started doing those duets with younger artists? Up until that point, everyone thought he's kind of square, no matter how great he is. You know, he's kind of square, and so, but, you know, he's now in he's like late 70s maybe, or something like that. His audience is dying, you know, like literally dying, you know. How does he manage to keep people coming to his shows because his audience is substantially all younger than he is. And if I live long enough and survive in this industry, then that's going to be true for me as well. So I'm, actively supporting that movement as much as I can. And the more that I work with younger artists, my visibility amongst their audience becomes more apparent, and they may show some interest in what I'm doing as long as it's got some musical validity to it.
Well, Todd, thank you very much indeed for your time today. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
My pleasure.
Thanks very much indeed.